Rain fell softly against the windows of the small cafe, each droplet catching the amber glow from inside and turning to liquid gold before sliding down the glass. The hour had grown late, and most customers had long since retreated to warmer places, leaving behind empty tables and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights that needed replacing. The cafe sat on the forgotten edge of the city, in a neighborhood where street lamps flickered uncertainly and buildings leaned against one another like tired old friends. It was the kind of place where people came when they wanted to disappear, even if only for an hour. The kind of place where no one asked questions about the stranger who walked in from the rain. He entered without sound, the door swinging open as though moved by the wind itself. Tall and pale, dressed in a simple dark coat that seemed to absorb the dim light around him, he commanded attention without seeking it. His presence filled the small space the way silence fills a room after the last note of music fades. The few remaining customers did not look up. They were too tired, too absorbed in their own small troubles, to notice that something ancient had just stepped across the threshold. But one person noticed. Eleanor stood behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a cloth she had been using to wipe down the coffee machine. She noticed because she had trained herself to notice. For months now, she had been watching doorways, studying faces, searching for something she could not name but would recognize instantly if she ever saw it. And now, there it was. She felt her heart stumble in her chest. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and refused to move further. The cloth slipped from her fingers and landed soundlessly on the counter. The stranger chose a table in the corner, away from the windows, away from the other patrons. He sat with his back to the wall, as though he had spent lifetimes learning that this was the safest position. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his brow, scanned the room once before settling into stillness. Eleanor forced herself to breathe. She picked up the cloth, set it aside, and reached for a cup with hands that trembled so badly she nearly dropped it twice. In the small kitchen behind the counter, tucked into a basket lined with soft blankets, her 3-month-old son stirred in his sleep. Eleanor glanced back at him, and the fear that had been building in her chest transformed into something sharper, something that felt almost like courage. She had waited too long for this moment to let it pass. The cafe owner, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Petrova, emerged from the back with a tired smile. She noticed Eleanor's pallor immediately. "You look unwell, dear. Is the baby keeping you up again?" Eleanor shook her head. "I'm fine. I just need to. I need to take that customer's order." Mrs. Petrova glanced at the corner table and shrugged. "Strange one, isn't he? Something about him feels familiar, though I can't say why." She patted Eleanor's shoulder. "Take your time. I'll watch the little one." Eleanor nodded, though she barely heard the words. She poured coffee into a cup, placed it on a small tray, and began the longest walk of her life. 12 steps. That was all it took to cross from the counter to his table. But with each step, Eleanor felt the weight of every sleepless night, every frightened whisper, every moment she had spent wondering if this day would ever come. The stranger did not look up as she approached. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, his breathing so quiet that she wondered if he breathed at all. She set the coffee down in front of him. The cup rattled slightly against the saucer. Still, he did not look up. Eleanor stood there for a moment, paralyzed by uncertainty. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, had imagined 100 different ways to speak the words that needed to be spoken. But now that the moment was here, her voice seemed to have abandoned her. Then, from behind the counter, she heard her son make a small sound in his sleep. It was enough. She leaned closer, close enough to smell the rain on his coat, close enough to see that his hands bore no wedding ring, no marks of any kind. She lowered her voice to barely more than a breath. "Please," she whispered. "Look at my baby. He has your eyes." The stranger's hands stopped moving. His entire being seemed to freeze, as though time itself had paused to observe this moment. Slowly, so slowly that Eleanor could count her own heartbeats between one movement and the next, he raised his head. His eyes met hers. They were crimson. Not the red of blood or fire, but a deeper shade, like garnets held up to candlelight. They were ancient eyes, eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, eyes that carried the weight of countless centuries. And in that instant, Eleanor knew she had found the right man. He stared at her without speaking, without blinking, without any expression that she could read. The seconds stretched into something that felt like hours. "Show me," he said at last. His voice was low and quiet, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in her chest rather than her ears. Eleanor nodded and retreated to the counter. Her hands were still shaking as she lifted her son from his basket, cradling him against her shoulder with the practiced ease of exhaustion. The baby stirred, made a small protesting sound, and then settled against her warmth. She returned to the stranger's table. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The cafe seemed to hold its breath around them. The rain continued to fall outside, but its sound had faded to a distant murmur. Then the baby opened his eyes. They were crimson. The exact same shade as the stranger's, as though the color had been carefully copied from one soul to another. The stranger's composure cracked. It was subtle, barely visible to anyone who was not watching closely, but Eleanor was watching closely. She saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into fists and then slowly released. She saw something ancient and guarded shift behind those immortal eyes. "How is this possible?" he asked, and for the first time, there was something vulnerable in his voice. Something almost human. Eleanor sank into the chair across from him, suddenly too tired to stand any longer. She cradled her son against her chest and met the stranger's gaze with all the courage she had left. "Do you remember," she began quietly, "the night of the winter solstice, 6 months ago? The old church on the hill outside the city, the one that burned down years ago?" The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly. "I remember. I was there that night. I was running from someone. Someone who wanted to hurt me." Eleanor's voice faltered, and she paused to steady herself. I hid in the ruins of the church because I thought no one would look for me there. But you were already inside. Recognition flickered in the stranger's eyes. Eleanor watched him remember, watched the pieces fall into place behind that ancient gaze. You were injured, he said slowly. I found you bleeding in the snow. Yes. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper now. You could have walked away. You could have done what others of your kind might have done. But you didn't. You carried me to shelter. You gave me something to drink, something warm that tasted like honey and starlight. And when I woke up the next morning, you were gone. The stranger was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. What I gave you was meant to heal your wounds. Nothing more. I know. Eleanor looked down at her son, at his small, perfect face, at the impossible crimson eyes that had already caused so much fear and wonder in her life. But something else happened that night. Something neither of us expected. She raised her head and met the stranger's gaze once more. He is yours, she said simply. I don't understand how or why, but he carries your blood. Your eyes. Your essence. He is your son. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. The stranger, the vampire king, though Eleanor did not yet know to call him that, stared at the child in her arms. For centuries, he had believed himself incapable of fathering new life. His kind did not create children. They created others of their kind through blood and shadow, through ancient rituals that had nothing to do with the warmth of human birth. And yet, this child existed. This impossible, miraculous child with crimson eyes and a heartbeat that sounded like music. Why did you wait until tonight to tell me? He asked quietly. Eleanor's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, though she made no sound. She had learned long ago to cry in silence. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid of what you might do. Afraid of what you might take from me. But I'm more afraid now of what's coming for us. The king leaned forward slightly. Explain. Eleanor wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a shuddering breath. There are others who have noticed his eyes. Strangers who watch us from across the street. Shadows that follow me home from work. Last week, someone left a note under my door. Her voice cracked. It said they know what he is. It said they're coming for him. The king's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air around him. The temperature in the cafe dropped by several degrees. The lights flickered once, twice. Who? He asked, and his voice was no longer gentle. I don't know. I don't know anything about your world, about what you are or what he might become. I only know that someone wants to take him from me, and I cannot. She pressed her lips together, struggling to maintain control. I cannot lose him. He is everything I have. The king looked at her for a long moment, at her worn uniform, at the dark circles beneath her eyes, at the fierce, desperate love that burned in her gaze despite her exhaustion. He had lived for thousands of years. He had ruled his kind through wisdom and strength, through careful diplomacy and, when necessary, through shows of power that made lesser beings tremble. He had accumulated wealth beyond measure, influence beyond imagining, knowledge beyond human comprehension. But he had never been a father. He had never known the weight of a child's life resting in his hands. Until now. "What is his name?" he asked quietly. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the question. "I named him Marcus. After my grandfather." Marcus. The king spoke the name slowly, as though tasting it. "It suits him." He rose from his chair and moved around the table. Eleanor tensed, instinctively pulling her son closer, but the king made no threatening gesture. Instead, he knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her level, and extended one pale hand. "May I?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The king reached out and touched the baby's cheek with infinite gentleness. Marcus stirred, opened his crimson eyes once more, and looked directly at the ancient being before him. And then, impossibly, the baby smiled. Something cracked open inside the vampire king's chest. Something that had been frozen for centuries, something he had believed long dead, stirred to life with painful intensity. "I will protect him," he said, and his voice carried the weight of an oath. "I will protect you both." Eleanor's tears began to fall again, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope that she had almost forgotten how to feel. "What do we do now?" she asked. The king rose to his feet and looked out the window at the rain-soaked street. "Now," he said quietly, "we leave. There are those among my kind who would see this child as a threat, and others who would see him as a prize. Neither can be allowed to find him before I have secured his safety." He turned back to Eleanor and offered his hand once more, this time to help her stand. "I know I am asking you to trust a stranger. I know I am asking you to leave behind everything familiar and step into a world you do not understand. But I give you my word, no harm will come to you or to Marcus while I still draw breath." Eleanor looked at his hand, at his crimson eyes, at the quiet certainty in his ancient face. She thought of the shadows that had been following her, of the fear that had been her constant companion for months, of the desperate, lonely vigil she had kept over her son's cradle every night. She took his hand. The journey that followed was strange and dreamlike, full of moments that Eleanor would struggle to explain to herself later. The king led her through the rain-soaked streets to a car that seemed to appear from nowhere, driven by a silent figure who asked no questions. They left the city behind and drove through darkness into countryside that grew wilder with each passing mile. But through it all, the king remained calm. He spoke to Eleanor in quiet tones, explaining what she needed to know without overwhelming her. He held Marcus carefully when she grew too tired to hold him herself, and the baby seemed perfectly content in his arms, as though recognizing something familiar in the ancient being's touch. They arrived at last at a house hidden among old trees, far from any road or town. It was not a castle or a mansion, but a simple stone dwelling with warm lights glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. A woman met them at the door, an older vampire with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, who introduced herself as Morgana and ushered them inside without hesitation. "I've prepared the east wing," she told the king. "The wards are in place. No one will find them here." The king nodded. "Thank you, old friend." The days that followed were quiet ones. Elena rested and recovered her strength. Marcus grew and thrived, his crimson eyes brightening with each passing week. And the king visited often, watching over them with a protective vigilance that never wavered. He did not try to claim Marcus or take him from Elena. He did not make demands or assertions of ownership. Instead, he simply stayed. He learned to hold the baby properly, to rock him when he cried, to speak to him in a low, soothing voice that seemed to carry echoes of lullabies from centuries past. And slowly, carefully, trust began to grow between them. One evening, as autumn leaves fell past the window and firelight danced across the walls, Elena sat beside the king and watched him cradle their sleeping son. "You could have walked away," she said quietly. "That night in the cafe, you could have denied everything. You could have disappeared and never looked back. Why didn't you?" The king was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I have lived for 3,000 years, he said. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have witnessed humanity at its worst and at its best. And in all that time, I have learned only one truth that matters." He looked down at Marcus, at the small, perfect face, at the tiny hands curled against his chest. "We are only as good as the love we choose to give. Everything else is just waiting to die." Elena felt tears sting her eyes once more, but this time she did not try to hide them. "He needs a father," she said. "Not a king, not a legend. Just, someone who will be there." The king met her gaze with those ancient crimson eyes, and for the first time, Elena saw something human in them. Something warm and uncertain and hopeful. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted. "I don't know if I'm capable of it." "Neither do I," Elena said. "I'm figuring out how to be a mother every single day. But I think we learn by trying. By showing up. By staying." The king looked at his son, their son, and nodded slowly. "Then I will stay," he said. "For as long as you'll have me. For as long as he needs me. I will stay." Months passed. The hidden house among the trees became a home. The shadows that had once pursued Elena and Marcus never found them, repelled by ancient protections and the watchful presence of their guardian. Marcus grew from an infant into a curious, bright-eyed child who laughed easily and reached for his father's hand whenever the king entered the room. He learned to walk across floors that had witnessed centuries of solitude, filling the ancient spaces with new life and new light. And the king, the immortal ruler who had stood apart from the world for so long, learned what it meant to belong. It was not the grand destiny that legends spoke of. There were no battles, no dramatic confrontations, no moments of terrible violence or dark sacrifice. There was only the quiet daily courage of presence, of patience, of showing up again and again to hold a small hand or wipe away tears or simply sit in companionable silence while the fire burned low. But that was enough. That was everything. On the day of Marcus's first birthday, Eleanor found the king standing by the window, watching their son play in the garden below. The ancient vampire's expression was soft, unguarded, full of wonder. "Thank you," he said quietly as she came to stand beside him. Eleanor looked up at him. "For what?" "For trusting me. For giving me the chance to be something other than what I was." He turned to face her, and his crimson eyes held a warmth she had never seen before. "You saved me, Eleanor. You and Marcus. You saved me from an eternity of loneliness." Eleanor reached out and took his hand. It was cool against her warmth, but she did not mind. She had grown accustomed to the temperature of his skin, just as she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his presence, the steadiness of his care. "We saved each other," she said simply. Below, in the garden, Marcus looked up and saw his parents watching him. He raised one small hand and waved, his crimson eyes bright with joy. And in that moment, surrounded by love and safety and the gentle hope of all the years to come, the Vampire King understood at last what it meant to be truly alive. Not the cold immortality of endless centuries. Not the lonely power of thrones and kingdoms. But this warmth, this connection, this small, precious, ordinary miracle of family. He waved back to his son, and for the first time in 3,000 years, he smiled without shadows.